Hey, Catalyst community, we just finished an interview with Chrissy King. This one will not be easy for you to listen to, but it's necessary. It's critical, not just for our industry, but for our world. Give it a listen. As always, this is an advanced version of an episode that will hit the Catalyst Health, Wellness, and Performance Coaching podcast in the next week or so. But we want to get this out to you early if you're a subscriber here on the channel. And if you're not, well, we'd love to have you join us. Just hit that subscribe button. So, this episode is all about our core mission of be a catalyst. So tune in, focus on it, sit with it a little bit, think it through, and let's go be a catalyst.
All right, Chrissy King, it is such a privilege to have you join us today. Strongly recommended. I'm excited about this conversation. It's one that needs to take place. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to chat with you too.
So let's get right in it. I loved your bio, by the way. It says you empower individuals in the wellness industry to create spaces that allow individuals from all backgrounds to feel, and then we're going to hit each one of these, seen, welcome, respected, and celebrated. So it's kind of like this progression, and I love the way you did that. So let's start by setting the baseline. Individuals from all backgrounds. What are we talking about here when it comes to health and wellness? Welcoming or seeing first individuals from all backgrounds who have been marginalized in the world of health and wellness.
I think when we think about health and wellness historically, it's just been marketed to a very particular type of people. So I think for people who are in Black and brown bodies or in transgender bodies or in larger bodies even, haven't necessarily always felt accepted in fitness spaces. And they definitely haven't felt like the fitness space was created with them in mind necessarily.
Right. Is that changing?
I do think it's changing a little bit. I think as a person who's been working in this space and working to create diversity and inclusion within the industry for over the past 5 years, I think that over the last year and year and a half, especially I think since the events of like George Floyd in summer of 2020, I think that that's the first time I saw the health and wellness industries really engaging these conversations in real and meaningful ways and really being open and receptive to having those conversations. And so I do think there has been some change. I think there's still a long way to go, but I definitely think the people in the industry are more open to having this conversation than they have been in the past.
Great. Very good. All right. So we'll go through this progression here in a second, but why do you think this has happened? Why are we where we are today? Not the last year and a half, but why has this been a barrier, or has it been selectively marketed, or however you want to say this? How did we get here?
I think whether we're talking about the health and fitness industry or any industry, really, I think we've gotten to this place to where certain people don't feel represented within industries. I think the overarching theme, I always honestly say it always goes back to, I think, racism and white supremacy and the ways that shows up in our everyday lives. So not necessarily, I think, people always thinking intentionally of it, but just recognizing or seeing that certain people, right, are consistently left in the margins of conversations, regardless of what those conversations are. And so I think that the reason the health and wellness industry is where it is just because we haven't really been intentional about making sure that we are creating spaces that feel good for everyone. And I think that goes back to a lot of times when we're thinking about traditional gym spaces or even just like fitness conferences, for example, and we see who are like presenting at the conferences and who are speaking and who are in the management positions. And more often than not, those people have a very similar background, right, in terms of race and gender and ethnicity. And so by default, we're missing important perspectives because those perspectives aren't at the table.
So we can't hear them because they're not on the schedule.
They're not on the schedule, right? And if you don't have that experience, right? Like, so for example, if you're not a person who comes from one of these marginalized communities, walking into a fitness or a gym space, there are things that may be happening there that you wouldn't even recognize, wouldn't be comfortable because that's not your perspective, right? That's not your position in the world. Right. And so that's why it's important that we're having these conversations and really intentionally bringing in people from different backgrounds so we can understand what that experience is like.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Good. All right. So again, your progressive growth with your bio. Love this. So let's just work our way through it. Let's start with seen. What can each of us do to start this progression and help with this element of being seen? Or seeing should be the phrase.
Yeah, seeing. I think really important, I think for all of us, no matter who we are. I think, I always take it back to before we can even think about how are we working to create diversity and inclusion. For me, anti-racism is the basis of diversity and inclusion. And so taking the time to really look at our own lives, which is really uncomfortable sometimes, actually all the time it's uncomfortable, right?
Sure.
But to look at our own lives and see, okay, how am I perhaps doing things that are without even recognizing it, adding to the problem, right? Or how am I being complicit? And really taking the time to study, because oftentimes we think of racism just in terms of like the KKK, for example, right? And yes, that's racism, but there are far more casual forms of racism that occur every day, like microaggressions, for example, right? Which are very casual forms of racism. So that involves things like talking to people perhaps and saying, what like very phrases like, oh, I don't you don't sound like a Black person, or saying things like, I don't see race, right? These very casual things that we say in conversation, not recognizing those are very harmful for people. And so I think that taking a step back and really doing the work to look at how are we being complicit within the system of racism and white supremacy, which again, very difficult work to do, but necessary work. I think that's the starting point for all of these things. When we're thinking about how we want people to be able to be seen and recognized and celebrated and respected, we have to take a step back and say, what are the things that I'm doing that are adding to people's inability to do that, or people's inability to feel safe and safe in gym spaces or in health and fitness spaces. And so one of my favorite books that I recommend to everyone is Me and White Supremacy. And again, this is such a great book because it breaks down these concepts in ways that are very digestible. And it's also a workbook that helps us to put these things into practice in our lives, because it's more than just reading it and having the information. It's about how am I actually like applying this information to my everyday life.
Let's sit on this for a little bit longer. Can you give us a few more examples? You threw out a couple of good ones of things that I might be doing without even realizing, somebody listening might be doing without even realizing it. Just help us hear this a little bit more.
Absolutely. So another thing I talk about moving into like the diversity and inclusion realm is, I think about how many fitness conferences I've gone to, and I did not see people who look like myself presenting, right? I saw a very white, very young, often very cisgender representation in terms of who's speaking at events. And so we think about that. If you're a person, again, from a marginalized, historically excluded community, right? So again, thinking Black and brown people, members of the LGBTQIA community, disabled community, and you're coming into these spaces and not seeing yourself represented. Again, that's another way of feeling like I don't belong here. This is not a space for me, right? I don't relate to the people or to their backgrounds even. And so when we're thinking about how are we going to be able to actually create change, that also means that when we can look at this and recognize, oh, we have this fitness conference happening, we have 20 speakers and most of them are white males, well then it's like, okay, so we have to change that, right? We have to actually say, not only is it a problem, we can start to understand why it's a problem, and then say, now I'm actually going to make some changes to what that looks like. And then we're thinking on a smaller scale, just like in traditional gym spaces. If you walk into a traditional gym space, a lot of places don't have gender neutral changing facilities, for example. So if you're a person that is non-binary or a trans, for example, you might not be able to safely use the bathroom or safely change clothes at a gym space. So these are all things that are happening within the fitness and wellness industry that I think, again, if that's not your experience, it's not something you would even necessarily think about, right? Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. The next one is welcome. Take us to, and then we'll go to respected and celebrated. They each build on one another. So we do a little bit better. We're not going to make huge strides overnight, but a little bit better with seen. Now, welcome. What's that next level?
Yeah, so making people feel welcome. Again, I think I already touched on this a little bit. Is like having gender neutral changing facilities, being mindful of our language, right, that we're using, and trying, again, making an effort to use gender neutral language, right? So often we go into gyms and we talk about these are what the men are lifting, this is what the women are lifting, right? And not making allowances for people who don't necessarily fit into the gender binary. And so thinking about just the words we are, the word choice we're using, thinking about the music choice that we're using, being mindful of like, if we're playing hip hop or rap music, are we using the censored versions of songs? Because again, if you're a person of color in a gym, especially if the membership is predominantly white and, you know, the N word is being used in music, that's really uncomfortable perhaps for a person of color in the gym. So really thinking intentionally about like, if I walked into this space and I wasn't the identity that I was, would I feel welcome here? Would I feel like this place that I would feel safe in? And so really requires that we think outside of our own identity and think through the perspective of someone with a different background than our own.
Okay. And then let's put the next two together: respected and even celebrated. So now we're taking up another notch and a half. What does that look like?
Yeah, so when I think of respected and celebrated, I love this quote from Verna Myers, who is a diversity and inclusion expert. And she talks about diversity as being asked to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. And so I like to think about this as like, you go to a party, for example, and you've been invited there. They say, oh, come on, you're welcome to come. But you go there and no one's talking to you and you're just standing on the wall by yourself, right? And the whole time you're looking at your watch and saying, wow, this is really, I'm here, but this is really uncomfortable. I don't feel like I belong. And I really can't wait till this is over and I'm ready to leave, right? Inclusion, when we're thinking about how people are feeling celebrated, that's when you go to a party, you're at that party and then someone comes and talks to you and they ask you like, hey, come dance with us, have a good time. And then 5 minutes later, you're in the middle of the dance floor, you're having the time of your life. And the whole time you're thinking, wow, I'm having so much fun. Then you look at the clock and realize the night's over and you're like, wow, I can't wait to come back and do that again. And when we're thinking about people coming to our spaces, we want them to feel like they've been asked to dance. We don't want them to feel like, yeah, you're here. Everyone's welcome, sure, but they don't feel a part of the environment. They don't feel a part of the space. They don't feel like they're being included or like their background, or their heritage, or their identity is being celebrated in that space. And so it's taking those extra steps to say, not only do we accept everyone here, but we are going to do everything we can to make sure that no matter who you are, when you come in here, you feel like this space was actually created with you in mind.
Okay, good. All right. What do you say to the person that says, come on, Chrissy, people are just whining. There's no issue here. You just do your thing. I'll do mine. It's all good. Whatever. Well, how do you respond to that kind of a comment or brushing off as if it's not an issue, et cetera?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I think that's been, pre-George Floyd, I always talk about that. I think that has really been a lot of the attitude in the health and wellness industry. Like, we come here to work out. We don't come here to talk about all these other things, right? But the reality is that if you are a person, again, that's a member of historically excluded community, when I walk into, as myself as a Black woman, for example, when I walk into the gym space, I don't take off my identity, right? Like, it comes with me everywhere I go. And so when we're thinking about health and wellness, it's not just about how people are able to move their bodies and what they put in there and what they eat in terms of nutrition. It's about spiritual, emotional, mental, physical health, right? All of these things together. And so you can't what I say to people is that you can't compartmentalize parts of your identity, right? When we're talking about overall health and wellness, all of those things matter. And so to someone who says, you're just whining, or like, that's not that important, or X, Y, and Z, I always encourage all of us to take a step back and look at our own privilege. And I think privilege is a word that sometimes gets like a dirty name, but the reality is that privilege is something that we all possess, no matter who we are, right? There's privilege based on race, gender, ethnicity, education, body size. So we all have access to privilege in some way, shape, or form, some of us more than others. And of course, when we're talking about white privilege, that's another form of privilege that people have as well. And so I think anytime we're talking about any issue and your stance is that, like, stop whining, stop complaining, it's most likely that you're talking from a perspective that's not your own, that you don't have that experience. And so for me, as an able-bodied person, I would never say to someone who says like, oh, this gym is not ADA compliant, my wheelchair can't fit in. Well, what would it be for me to say, oh, just stop whining and complaining about it, right? When I'm an able-bodied person, that's not an issue that affects me.
Nice.
And so I think we always, anytime we're just trying to throw away or like minimize people's experiences, especially when they're not our own, it's always a time for us to step back and say, am I living this experience through my own privilege? And am I considering what it would be like to live within, to have someone else's identity and experience in the world?
That's a great example. Yeah, I think that sticks for a lot of people, at least for me. All right, so you provide some interesting insights about body neutrality in your interview with Good Housekeeping lately. I think it was a month ago. Could you walk us through some of the meaning behind this phrase, why it's important, and maybe initial steps we can take in terms of this concept?
In terms of the concept around body neutrality?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, I think for so long, the fitness industry has been hyper-focused on fat loss as a determinant of health. And I think, reading books, another great book I recommend around this is the book Anti-Diet. The reality is that exercise, it does not have to be used only as a source of fat loss. And I think, again, it puts so much pressure on people and we put so much pressure on ourselves to look a certain way, right? And so maybe going through measures that aren't even good for us in order to attain a smaller body, thinking oftentimes that by having a smaller body that is going to make us feel better about ourselves or make us feel more worthy or more deserving of attention or love or whatever. And I think what, in my experiences working with people, particularly women, is that, the reality is most of us want to feel good in our bodies, right? But and so that doesn't necessarily have to do with a number on the scale. And so I encourage people to think about, when I approach fitness and exercise, am I looking at this number is going to make me feel better? Or am I thinking about how I want to feel in my body? Meaning, do I want to feel energized and nourished and whole? And do I want to be able to, run with my kids or keep up with whatever, or go up down the steps feeling out of breath? Like, let's focus on those things versus focusing on like this particular number on the scale, because we recognize our bodies change, right? And that's just the reality. Bodies were created to change. And although we live in a society that is, Western standards of beauty are really hyper-focused on being a smaller body, especially if you're a woman, the reality is that doesn't make us more valuable or more worthy. And so I think when I am thinking and talking about body liberation and body neutrality, I'm thinking and talking to people through the lens of recognizing that our bodies are the least interesting thing about us, for one. And number two, recognition also that our bodies are the thing that allows us to have the human experience. And if we're spending all of our energy focused on shrinking it, we're really missing out on life and experiences because we are succumbing to these standards that tell us we're supposed to look or be a certain way in the world.
So as I was reading the article, you mentioned this body positivity, which I guess is I'm not that familiar with it, but it sounds like it's a pretty popular thing. And you're saying, that's not that helpful. Can you help us with that and how that's different from body neutrality?
So body positivity, it's actually, okay, so I'm going to answer this as for people who aren't familiar. People who aren't familiar, body positivity space is really a space that was actually created by and for Black women in particular who didn't see themselves recognized or didn't see themselves represented in society in positive ways. And so over time, the body positivity movement has really has been co-opted and changed a lot. Now it really hyper focuses on like self-love and loving your body, which by the way are great things. And I want everyone to be able to love their body and accept their bodies. But I think the part that, the reason I'm not a huge fan of it now and the way that in the current iteration of it is because, again, it is so focused on, loving your body. And the reality is that when you're working through body image issues, you are not going to wake up every day and look in the mirror and love your body. That's just the fact, right? And I think this idea that that's what it's supposed to be sets us up for failure. So the idea of body neutrality, or even more working towards body liberation, is more the idea that I don't necessarily have to look in the mirror and love everything that I see, but I can still show my body respect, and I can still treat myself with compassion versus like disparaging remarks or disdain because I don't love everything. So it's like, can I look in the mirror and not love everything I see and still treat myself with respect and dignity and be neutral about how I look versus saying, oh my gosh, I look so gross, or, oh, I hate what I see in the mirror. And so that's like a little bit of a difference between body positivity and neutrality, and a very brief explanation.
Sure. No, I think that's helpful. And then combining that with, it is the health and wellness industry. making improvements. So it's not I'm totally fine. I don't need to make any changes. I'm good as I am. That's not the direction of this. This is saying there's a lot of good and I want to make some improvements in whatever, what I've got areas I'm working on, you've got areas you're working on, et cetera. How do those interact, or are they completely separate things?
Yeah, I think that's going to be different for everybody, right? But I think there's a lot of, like, for people who don't truly understand body positivity, there's a lot of idea that means just like, oh, you don't care about your health or you don't care about whatever. And that is absolutely not the truth at all. Again, I'm going to reference a book, Anti-Diet, which goes into a lot of these things in detail, and also the health at every size movement, recognizing that health does not have to be associated to a size. And so for people curious about not only the distinction, but more so curious about, like, how can I be comfortable and neutral in my body without feeling like I don't care about my health, right? And those things those things can work together. You can care about your health and also say, I appreciate and respect my body in its current iteration. And so I always refer back to the health at every size movement, and recognizing again that the goal is, what is my reason for exercising? What is my reason for nutrition? And if it's to be healthy, defining what that means for you, because that word healthy is used every day by people and it means very different things. So thinking about that, what that actually means for you practically. And then also thinking about how can we again make those goals focus on things that are not just centered in how much does the scale say.
Okay, good. Okay, let's continue with this nutrition topic, because you wrote an article for Shape that talked about this idea of food is fuel, which I say that all the time. It ignores the fact that food represents a gathering and community. And I was just thinking as I was reading your article, yeah, like that's what we do as a family. That's how it brings us together. That's our excuse for gathering. Thoughts on how to bring these two together, of fuel and community and gathering, all into a usable, functional, positive approach?
Yeah, I mean, realistically, again, that the term food is fuel is true. Of course it is, but
Sure.
again, it is so much more than that. And I think that unfortunately, like especially in the exercise and fitness industry, we've like really demonized food in some ways. And you feel guilt.
Yeah.
Guilt eating cultural foods even, or eating foods that, bring you joy for whatever reason. We've like erased this idea that it's okay to also eat food for pleasure, that it can only be for sustenance only. And so again, I challenge people to always be decolonizing our mind, because we've all been taught a lot of things. We've been programmed with a lot of things growing up, right? So to decolonize our mind around the good, the morality of food, and then also around this idea of like good versus bad food. And again, learn to trust our own bodies, because I think one of the things that we see happen in the fitness and exercise industry so often is we are looking to people for the answers, right? Tell me what I should eat. Tell me what I shouldn't eat. Tell me what's good for me. Tell me what's bad for me. And none of us are the same, right? And I think that in our desires, what satiates our bodies, what works for our bodies, it's so different for all of us. And so I think that when we're talking about food nutrition, I encourage people to let go of so much of this things that we've been taught and get back to like, okay, what actually feels good? Like our bodies are really intuitive. We can trust our bodies. And when we eat certain foods, we feel energized, we feel like ready to go. And then we eat certain foods and we don't feel so great. And so it's like, instead of looking for someone to give us all the answers, start thinking intuitively, what is actually working for my body? What feels good? And again, I encourage people as much as possible to let go of this idea of good versus food or morality around food choices.
Good. Very well said. All right. A couple more. If you had a magic wand, you could instantly change the world of health and wellness. What would it be like after that magic kicked in?
I mean, honestly, I think it would just be a space in which everyone actually, in all circumstances, feel like fitness and wellness is for me. And I say that because because I know that the benefits of wellness are for everyone, and it serves so much purpose for so many of us. And I think especially we look over the last 18 to 20 months, we've had a lot of stresses in our life. We've had a lot of pressures, and wellness is so beneficial for reasons beyond just fat loss and all these things, right? It's for the mental, it does so much for our mental health and our emotional health, as well as our physical well-being. But unfortunately, in a lot of ways, fitness feels inaccessible to certain people. It feels like in terms of financially, but also in terms of just like, again, do I belong here? Am I going to be able to go and find someone that I can work with that is relatable to me, that feels like at a similar age perhaps, or a similar demographic background? And so if I could change it, I would wish it would actually just feel good and accessible for everyone in terms of just, and also in terms of like the things we talked about, like having gender neutral fitness facilities and having ADA compliant facilities, so that people can really feel like they can go and engage in wellness and feel good in their bodies without worrying about all these other factors.
Got it. Okay, good. You wrote a very well-written blog pretty recently, and you had this comment or this statement you used at the very end. I'm just going to read the whole thing. Now, folks, listen to this carefully, because I'm going to ask her to unpack this for us a little bit. If you're feeling triggered or defensive at this point, I challenge you to sit with those feelings of discomfort and start to unpack, leaving behind fragility and defensiveness. It requires listening to feedback that will likely be hard to accept. None of this is easy, but despite that, it is completely necessary if we ever hope to dismantle systems of oppression. People are feeling that right now. Unpack that for us a little bit. Help us listen in, help us digest this conversation we're having.
Yeah, I mean, I think that all of the things that we're talking about in this conversation, in conversations about systems of oppression, racism, white supremacy, all of these things are hard conversations to have, right? Like these aren't the warm and fuzzy conversations that you walk away feeling awesome. It actually requires us to do a lot of introspection, to look at things that, again, perhaps we're engaging with that we didn't recognize, that we didn't see about ourselves, that's really uncomfortable. But when I talk about this, I always like to talk about, especially when I'm talking to people in the fitness industry, I always like to go back to like when we first started strength training, or we decided to like train for a 5K. I remember my first strength training workout ever was miserable. My body hurt in miserable. Like my body hurt in places I didn't know could hurt. And
I hear you.
Why would I want to do this? But again, I knew like there was a goal I had in mind, right? And so I understood that the pain associated with that was even though it was really painful at the time, on the other side was going to be something really good. And it's no different than when we're talking about having difficult conversations around racism. Like, yes, it's super uncomfortable, but if we are familiar with the pain associated with exercising and working out, and we can push through that, we can push through these things as well. Because again, we have a goal on the other end. We're trying to change the landscape of the fitness industry. We are trying to make this a space that's more accessible for everyone. So we recognize that doesn't come without discomfort, and difficult conversations, painful conversations. Like that is a part of the growth process, just like it's a part of the growth process when it comes to exercise.
And you've given us some homework assignments. So I wrote down the books. I'll make sure I got the main ones. Me and White Supremacy. It's a book and a workbook. Is that right? Is that the one that had the book? Okay. And then Health at Every Size, and the Anti-Diet book. What was that one? Anti-Diet?
By Chrissy Harrison.
Chrissy Harrison. Mm-hmm. Perfect. All right. Wonderful stuff. I don't want to wrap up yet without giving you kind of, Brad, you forgot to ask me this question. Man, we should have dug into this. Just wide open, anywhere you'd like to take this, any final words of wisdom or something you want to bring up that I did not tee up for you very well. Take us where you'd like on this kind of like wrap-up session.
I think we talked about a lot actually, so I don't really want to add anything more to the conversation, but I do want to say that again, when we're having difficult conversations, it's never a place for, I don't want anyone to walk away from this conversation feeling guilt or feeling shame. It's always a place to question with compassion and curiosity about maybe topics that you haven't thought about before, or in ways that you haven't thought about them before. And so I encourage anyone, again, who is feeling triggered to just sit with this with compassion and kindness, and with yourself and just with the conversation in general, versus the feelings of defensiveness and shame that might naturally come up.
Beautiful. Chrissy, I really, really appreciate this. One of the professors here at a local university suggested I reach out to you, and I'm so glad it's worked out. So thanks for working around your schedule.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It was a great conversation.